Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this talk with Fatima Bhutto and Naomi Klein. We are very, very happy to have you. Also present is our co-host, Minal Munshi, as well as oh goodness, I got Mariam Tareen. Sorry, I got your Instagram name stuck in my head. I was going to say the writing room, and I just thought that was not right. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to do a quick introduction about what's happening currently in Pakistan on the ground. The situation, of course, is escalating in many ways. While the floodwaters are retreating, there's still a lot of standing water, which has resulted in a health crisis, in a malaria and dengue epidemic. We've been doing medical camps in Pakistan in a few locations, and we are unable to serve people with malaria, unfortunately, even though there are cures and there are tests available in the world, but in Pakistan, they have run out. We have run out. Even in major cities, we have run out. There is also an increase of snake bite cases, and people are dying from snake bites, for which antivenoms should be available in Pakistani hospitals, but unfortunately, people are being turned away for lack of life-saving medicines. So we're witnessing a really frightening rise in the death toll simply from ailments that actually could be resolved, but unfortunately there are many cracks in our system that are being revealed, particularly within the medical health system. But today we'll be talking more in depth about climate justice, climate reparations, as well as Naomi Klein's work.
Maybe Minal can just say a few things about. Thank you to everyone who donated. Minal is just going to tell you a little bit about the organizations we're supporting.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who donated. So we've collected about £77,000 so far from 755 donations. So that's a lot of people who've been very generous. We've so far sent about half of that off to organizations. So we're supporting 3 organizations. One is the ED Foundation, which a lot of people are familiar with. It's the largest kind of relief foundation in Pakistan, and they're focusing on rescue and emergency relief. And then there is Legal Aid Society, which is doing dry food rations. So they're delivering dry food rations, and as well as birthing kits and other, and also like emergency medicine, since that's becoming an increasing problem, as Zulfikar said. And the third one is Child Life Foundation, which focuses on emergency healthcare for children. So they run emergency rooms in major hospitals in Sindh and across the country as well. And they're treating about normally 300 to 400 children a day in one emergency room, and currently 1,200 to 1,500 a day because the need has increased so greatly. So thank you so much for your donations, and all of your money is going to these 3 organizations and reaching, I think, the most vulnerable in Sindh. Thank you so much.
Mariam?
Very quickly, if anybody has any questions, please enter them into the chat. And if we have time at the end, we'll get to them. We'll get to as many as we can. Thanks.
So we'll just start. I mean, this is such an enormous issue and a tragedy on so many levels. Naomi, the figures we're hearing out of Pakistan are just mind-boggling. The fact that 1/3 of the country has been submerged underwater, 50 million people have been internally displaced. These are catastrophic floods that have been caused by intensive monsoon rains, but worsened by the fact that Pakistan's glaciers, the second largest population of glaciers to the polar regions, are melting at an unprecedented rate. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the climate crisis at the moment a code red for humanity, but he also called what's happening in Pakistan climate carnage. And, you know, a lot of what Pakistanis have been seeing so far is that nobody seems really to care, to be that shocked by this. But in the same month, in the last weeks, Nigeria is facing the worst flooding in a decade. We were just talking about Puerto Rico is being battered. the Philippines, Canada, Cuba. Today, 2 million people in Florida are without power because of catastrophic rain and wind. Is this the new normal? I mean, is this what we've been warned about? Has it finally come to pass?
Well, it's very good to be with all of you. And I just want to extend a huge thank you to all of the organizers, and most importantly for the work that you're doing on the ground, and really for providing people with trusted connections to frontline relief organizations. I think, there's tends to be some like cynicism about donating because people are worried about whether the money is actually going to reach the people who they intend it to reach. And some of that cynicism is warranted. So initiatives like yours, where you have personal connections and you're saying this money is going to reach these children and, these families who have been displaced it's absolutely critical. So I just want to thank you so much and just extend just my deepest sympathies to everyone here who's been directly impacted and have family and friends who've been directly impacted. Is this the new normal, Fatima? Look, what I would say is we're in it. We're in it. That we're in, I sometimes say we're in the time of prophecy. We're in the time that has been prophesied, that has been warned about. And that requires that we change, our tenses. So for so long, it's been like, when this happens, the future, a glimpse of the future. No, this is present. And this has been present for a long time. But, what you're describing, where there are these staccato disasters around the world, and, not even the floods in Pakistan are not just one disaster. They themselves are a layering of multiple disasters: colonialism, debt, structural adjustment, militarism, COVID, inflation, the shockwaves from the war in Ukraine. So that's just one crisis that is itself a kind of poly-crisis. And then we zoom out globally and we see that, so many territories are facing their own crises. Some people talk about compassion fatigue. Look, I think really it's selective compassion. We have to be honest, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing that's always worried me most about the climate crisis is how it intersects with white supremacy, how it intersects with capitalism, and to bringing us to this age of climate barbarism. That's or climate apartheid, where the wealthy world that created the crisis doubles down and responds by fortressing its borders, with extreme kind of selective compassion. While you were talking, Fatima, my mind went back to floods in the UK in 2012, which was really the first time when the UK was like, okay, we're directly impacted by climate change. And the Daily Mail, right-wing tabloid, ran a front page petition calling for the slashing of foreign aid in response to the UK floods. Let's stop helping people in the global south. We need to protect our own. It was completely causal. The floodwaters hadn't even receded, right? And so this is why I think when we talk about how do we respond to this poly-crisis, it's not going to be Band-Aids. It is a crisis born of worldview, of a fatally lethal worldview that has always sacrificed people, that has always ranked humanity at its very essence. And we're not getting out unless we actually tackle that worldview and transform it and replace it with worldviews that have been suppressed but never went away, right? That really are based on interconnection, interrelation, and true equality.
Thank you. My question is something that this is a word that's been thrown around a lot, and it'll probably be thrown around some more in this conversation. But what exactly does climate justice look like? Is it simply a matter of what I think the government of Pakistan and what the UN have been really hounding, which is this idea of climate reparations? Is it debt cancellation? Is it actually accountability of the Pakistani state itself? We know that they are not innocent necessarily, right? They have taken the loans, they've done the infrastructural projects that have exacerbated this issue. They themselves are not don't have a track record of being entirely accountable. Is it a mix of these things? Is it also local governments that need to be a part of climate reparations? What is your opinion on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I don't think there is one thing that is climate justice, but I think maybe a zoom out big picture answer is that it is battling the causes of climate change and the impacts of climate change, and by causes I mean fossil fuel emissions, and repairing the damage done by the structures that produce those emissions, right? So battling poverty, battling inequality, battling injustice as we lower our emissions, right? So, I'll give you an example from where I live, because the truth is that though we have these massive north-south inequalities, we also have huge inequalities in the north, right? I live in Canada, and when you talk about 50 million people displaced, that's significantly more people than live in my country, right? So I keep reminding myself of just the scale of this, right? But where I live in British Columbia, a mashup of two colonial British and Christopher Columbus, we in the past year and a bit, we had a heat dome. We've had to learn all these new weather terms. Okay, so heat dome. This was this heat wave where temperatures were so high that a town spontaneously combusted. And that was June of 2021. We had something called an atmospheric river, which also washed away highways. But of course, our ability to recover is very different, right? Mm-hmm. But even within a disaster like this, 600 people died in that heat dome in a wealthy, glimmering city like Vancouver. And who died? The poorest people living in completely inadequate housing, tenants whose landlords wouldn't let them use a fan. This is happening in the global north, right? So locally, absolutely reparations. It just means fixing what is broken as we transform, because in the face of climate change, we do need to change everything. This is one of the slogans of the movement, right? And so if we have to change the building blocks of our societies, how we get our energy, what our transportation systems look like, why wouldn't we seize that opportunity to begin to heal these structural inequalities? And so that means between countries, that means within countries, that means within cities, within towns, because look, we are a scarred world. That's the hope of climate justice. And I'll just tell you a very quick story. I didn't come to this through being a lifelong environmentalist. I am somebody who's been focused on economic justice and the impacts of war and occupation. And I first heard about the idea of climate justice and climate reparations when I was researching reparations from slavery and colonialism. And I was at a UN conference in Geneva, and this was in 2009. And I met a delegation from Bolivia whose glaciers were melting very, very rapidly, as Pakistan's are. And they said, we've been fighting for reparations for colonialism because our country's been looted. This is when Evo Morales was president. We believe that the drivers of colonialism are the same drivers of climate change, that the wealth looted from Bolivia, this is famously Eduardo Galeano wrote that the silver from Potosi could build a bridge across the Atlantic, right, in Bolivia. That is what created the excess wealth that allowed the global north to produce the excess emissions that are overheating the world. And they said, but unlike colonial looting, carbon is measurable to the molecule. We know who emitted what when. And so we believe that climate justice would actually bring us reparations for colonialism, and would be the deep solutions that we need to, as Eduardo Galeano said, we live in a world upside down to turn the world right side up. And the Bolivian delegation to COP that year called for a Marshall Plan for planet Earth. And that's the scale we need to think at. And I think as you are in the midst of this disaster and just so overwhelmed by the scale of it, I think we need to try to capture people's imaginations with this possibility, because as you know, that the sense of hopelessness is so extreme. We can't, almost see our way out of it.
Miriam Kaba says that hope is a discipline. And I think maybe this is a two-parter, but you said before that it's not humans and it's not carbon that drive the climate crisis. It's capital, it's capitalism, and the fact that it has locked us in physically, politically, and culturally into the world that capital creates. But you've also said that one of the things it does is that it denies us the collective spaces that we need in which to confront the raw terror of ecocide. And I'm just wondering if you can speak a bit more about that. How do people build those spaces? How do they rebuild them? Have they ever been built before? What do we do?
Yeah. I think it's important to diagnose the drivers of the crisis correctly and to talk about these the underlying structures that produce the crisis, the underlying worldviews that produce the crisis, because it disentangles it from this idea of human nature. Humans are complicated. Humans are a lot of things. Humans are incredibly selfish and venal, and incredibly compassionate and beautiful. And nowhere do we see this more clearly than in the midst of a disaster, right? I'm sure you've all seen examples of that in your lives where people are putting everything on hold just to help. They want to help. They see people they do not know, and they are just going, whatever I can do, I will do it, right? And then a few days later, maybe that same person will make a decision that is not so compassionate and not so kind, right? And so, I think we tend to live in a culture that is very into labeling people. You're this kind of person, you're that kind of person. I think it's more helpful to say, like, we're a mess. We are that person that wants to help. We are that person who just cares about ourselves and our family. And the systems we live in light up different parts of ourselves, right? And we live under global capitalism, and global capitalism tells us that we are, it's all about what individuals have done to produce their outcomes. It blames victims. It says that if you're, rich enough to buy your own rockets, it's because you're so smart and not because of the systems that built you up. And so really, it's a system that suppresses the best parts of ourselves and encourages the worst parts of ourselves. And we need systems that light up our best parts and like supports the systems of care, right? We saw during COVID too, we saw the systems of mutual aid that people spontaneously set up wherever they lived. But then, they got ground down by the pressures of work, by the pressures of debt, by just what it means to live under these sort of crushing systems. And that's why, I don't like terms like Anthropocene, which name our era as basically, the age of man, as if humans are one thing. And that suppresses the systems that actually exist and existed and exist still, that build societies based on relationality and interdependence. And so if humans are all one thing, we're doomed, right? If there is this thing called human nature and it's short-termism and it's just me, well, throw in the towel, right? Because that determines everything. Now, if it's capitalism, if it's white supremacy, if it's colonialism, if it's patriarchy, that's hard. That's hard as hell. But these are systems that humans created, and humans can create other systems.
I think just sort of tagging along with the capitalism question, there's so much first world guilt, or there's so much guilt from the wealthy, even of the quote unquote global South. And it's really pushing a lot of, catchy phrases around sort of, green cities and green this and green that and ecological this and biological that and just sort of throwing around phrases to make things sound more environmentally sustainable. What is your opinion about this? I mean, we've already started calling it greenwashing, which I think is really, really interesting. And I think the environmental movement in some ways may be taking a leaf from a lot of other movements when it sort of uses this word. But what is your opinion on greenwashing?
Well, it's definitely
Sorry.
It's okay. It's the era of Zoom pets. So look, I don't know if it's because of guilt that we have greenwashing. I think it's probably more because of greed that we have greenwashing, in the sense that people, I think a lot of people see an opportunity, and there's definitely a kind of there's a green gold rush at work, and the tricky thing, yes, the puppy hates greenwashing. The tricky thing is that people do get confused, right? When they want to do something, and they see, okay, so they see maybe a green energy project in their communities or a bunch of charging stations for electric vehicles and so on. And so it looks like something is happening. But we're beyond the age, we're beyond the moment where like doing a little something will do. We actually need to do what it takes, right? Like we are in a moment where we have to do what is required. And that, that's the importance of moments like, when we listen to climate scientists and they tell us what our carbon budget is and how much we need to lower our emissions, that is what needs to guide us, not, whether Elon Musk came up with, some way to make money from, electric vehicles. I mean, if you look at what the billionaire class is saying, they've given up on Earth. They have literally given up on Earth. When Jeff Bezos went to space, he came back gushing about what a great place it was to throw our garbage, and how, we could have space colonies and continue the human race that way. These are the last people we should listen to. They see money that they can make in green technology because there's a lot of money being thrown at it, but that is not the same as quote unquote solving the climate crisis. And so we have to be very, very, very careful about this, because I think we're seeing a lot of it in the run up to the UN climate summit in Egypt. The Sisi's government sees all kinds of opportunity in green hydrogen and so on. It's a windfall. Is it the same as responding to the climate crisis? No, capitalism is adaptable. It can have niche markets, and we often hear about, an all of the above energy strategy, which is something Barack Obama used to talk about. It's absolute nonsense. You actually have to make choices. Yes, you can have green energy, and that means you need to transition and scale and ultimately retire your fossil fuel infrastructure. We often say economists can add, but they don't know how to subtract, right? And that's how I think we need to assess these green technologies. Are they just about procrastination? Are they about delay? And a lot of times they are, right? Especially the promise of things like carbon capture and storage. Frankly, we haven't hit rock bottom of where this is going to go, because the next stage of this is geoengineering, which is this idea sometimes called planet hacking. And, they're going to be using the extreme desperation in Pakistan and other frontline nations to say, well, now we need to spray sulfur into the stratosphere to dim the sun. I don't know if you've been following some of this, but this is where, some of the kind of defeatism around climate change is going. We're not going to do what's necessary. So now we just need to hack the planet. So these are very, very, very high risk interventions. And what's really scary, if you look at the peer reviewed articles on this, is that the countries that are most at risk for something like they call it solar radiation management, which means managing the rays of the sun. So you spray reflective particles into the upper atmosphere, and it has the same effect as a high altitude volcano. After a high altitude volcano, you have cooler winters because not as much of the sun's rays make it down to Earth. So basically, they want to solve the problem of pollution with more pollution. They want to literally pollute the upper atmosphere deliberately. The problem is, when you look at what happens after high altitude volcanoes, is that it interferes with your monsoon season. And so the scenario that I fear the most is wealthy countries saying, well, we're worried about our crops. Let's spray some high altitude particulates. And it ends up impacting the people who are already most impacted in the water supply. So I think we need to be very vigilant about this. I usually don't talk about that much, but I'm hearing more and more that this is going to come in the guise of a climate justice solution.
Right.
I mean, maybe this is the point to ask about shock doctrine and the way in which these terrible crises will be exploited, whether by corporations, by local elites. Will you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, so shock doctrine is a phrase I started using actually back in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina, and also the Asian tsunami, right? So some of you will remember the devastating tsunami, Christmas Eve tsunami in 2004, that caused thousands of deaths, huge numbers of displaced people in coastal communities, mainly in India, Thailand, Sri Lanka. And what I reported on at the time was small boat fishing people, smallhold farmers, reporting that when they went back to their homes and their farms, there were fences around them because they had precarious title. They didn't have title to their land. It turns out this was land that was very desirable to resort developers, to big agribusiness companies, and there was a massive land grab after the tsunami. There was also 3 days, I think it was 3 days, a little rusty. It was quite a few years ago, but just a few days after the tsunami hit Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan government tried to push through a water privatization bill. More recently, before Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico, there were calls to privatize the electricity system, which happened, and that's part of the reason why Puerto Rico was as vulnerable as it was to this hurricane. So look, cynicism knows no bounds. I said, people are complicated. Corporations are not. They have one goal, which is to make as much money as possible. And they see that in these moments of shocks and dislocation, that is the moment where people are distracted by emergencies, by staying alive, by the kinds of emergencies that you are trying to tend to: malaria, dengue, venom bites. They're not thinking about whether they're going to lose their land. They're thinking about whether they're going to lose their kid, right? And the cynicism is so extreme. I unfortunately have seen it again and again. Wherever it is in the world, these disasters, folks are seeing dollar signs and opportunities to push the pre-existing wish list. Yeah. So it's a time to be vigilant, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Climate activism has become, genuine climate activism that isn't about buzzwords and greenwashing, like we were talking about, has become such a dangerous field. And we're looking forward now towards. Well, I don't know if we're looking forward to it, but we're into the future. We're going to be seeing the COP27 is going to be held in Egypt. How much value can a meeting like the COP have, especially in terms of climate justice, when hundreds of activists like Ala Abdel Fattah are being starved behind bars?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's really quite a scandal that Egypt is even allowed to host the UN Climate Summit. There does need to be an African climate summit, an African COP, as they're called. But, General El-Sisi seized power in a military coup in 2013. It is the most brutal regime in modern Egyptian history, more brutal than Mubarak's. And it's not hundreds. It's, by some estimate, tens of thousands of prisoners of conscience behind bars in Egypt. Environmental NGOs, all NGOs, but we're talking about a climate summit. Activists in Egypt who have tried to contest Egypt's dependence on coal and the health impacts locally have faced persecution. In Egypt, if you want to pick up the litter and call yourself an environmental NGO, that's fine. But if you want to target industry and government and anything that's going to actually threaten profits, you could very, very likely end up in jail. And so, the symbol of this is, for many of us, Ala Fattah, and he is, he published a remarkable book from prison, his prison letters. You have not yet been defeated. I was honored to write the foreword for that book and really recommend that people pick it up if they can, because all of the proceeds go to support the campaign for his freedom. He's been, he was one of the iconic faces of Tahrir Square, of the youth-led revolution that overthrew Mubarak. He's in prison now for reposting a Facebook post that talked about another prisoner being torture to death. And that was called fake news. And he's behind bars. He's been on a hunger strike now for, I think, something like 180 days. I think he has 100 calories a day. His sisters who have seen him say he's unrecognizable. This is the only tool he has is this hunger strike to try to draw attention. And frankly, I think a lot of Egyptian activists, when the COP was announced, they thought that maybe this situation would get some attention. The fact that journalists are the free press has been shut down. A wonderful media outlet like Maramasser is blocked in Egypt. And I think there was a real hope that if the international climate community came to Egypt, maybe it would put pressure on Sisi's regime to have a mass prisoner release. But it's been unfortunate that there hasn't actually been enough focus from the international climate community. I think now, as people are getting ready and thinking, am I going to be safe in Egypt? Now they're starting to think, is anyone safe in Egypt? I think there's still a chance, if people raise their voices, that Alaa Abd el-Fattah might get released, but that's one person. I think we have a chance to really act in strong solidarity with people. This is the power of Tahrir Square, right? And thinking about that moment of possibility and what it represented and what is happening now in Egypt, I think is emblematic of kind of the lights going out in a lot of the world, right? And a rising fascistic governance, and it's happened. Just look at what just happened in Italy. So I don't think we can have, one thing I know for sure, we're not going to have climate justice without political freedoms. And the idea that we can pry these things apart is a fantasy. So we need a climate justice movement that is standing in solidarity with prisoners of conscience around the world. And, I think COP's going to be a big test. I think we should make this more than Sisi bargained for. That's all I'll say.
It brings to mind what Mike Davis said recently in that wonderful interview he gave to The Guardian, that there's so much unmobilized love in the world. And I love that. One needs that now more than ever, because we tend to despair, but actually, as you said, we can do the opposite. We can make the opposite more powerful. Can
I say one thing, Fatima? Just
please.
A little thing just to share with you, which actually hasn't been made public, but Alaa's family shared with me a letter that he wrote a couple of weeks ago from prison, and they were really worried because he writes them a letter a week, and 1 week there was no letter, and they thought something had gone wrong, that maybe he had, he's very sick, and they're very worried about his health. And then they got a follow-up letter, and he said, no, I wrote you. I would never not write you, but they confiscated the letter. It was about climate change, and it was because of the floods in Pakistan, and he had gotten news of it in jail, and he wrote this whole long letter, and he summarized it for his mother. And he was worried about the glaciers, and he was worried about the intersection. He was worried about Modi and, how it would intersect with Hindu extremism when these types of disasters hit India. And he was thinking about the whole subcontinent. And I just thought, my God, Alaa is sitting there on hunger strike in prison after almost a decade in jail, thinking about the world. And are we thinking about him?
God, it makes me want to cry. As Naomi said, if you can get Alaa's book, it's published by Fitzcarraldo Editions. Please do get it and support him and keep him in your mind in the coming weeks and beyond. I just have really one more sort of big-ish question, and then, well, maybe two questions, and then we can try and open it up. So if anyone has questions, can you put them in the chat, and we will come to you shortly. I'm just wanting to talk to you, Naomi, about what the climate envoy to the US, John Kerry, said at the UN General Assembly just recently. When he was asked about reparations, John Kerry said, "You tell me the government in the world that has trillions of dollars, because that's what it costs." I mean, that
I think
comes
we all know the government who has trillions of dollars.
he was the one talking, but it seemed to me obscene. It seemed a kind of obscenity that the U.S. climate envoy could say something like that. And then today I was talking to a friend about the conversation we're going to have, and she pointed me in the direction of Professor Miles Allen, who talks about the fact that fossil fuel companies could fix the climate crisis, he says, within a generation, if they wanted to. And the example he gives is, he talks about the ozone issue, and he says, we didn't fix the ozone by not wearing deodorant. We fixed it by going to the companies that caused the problem and saying, fix it. And the same, he feels, could be true of fossil fuel companies. And I'm just wondering, if you think that's possible, what would one need to do to make that possible? And I'm also reminded of what Professor Chomsky suggests, which is jail time for CEOs that don't reduce their emissions. I mean, which of these is the most realistic?
So I think expropriation of these companies is more realistic. And sure, yes, jail time as well. But the idea that they're just going to fix it on their own, it's not like the analogy with the hole in the ozone layer isn't the same, because that was just changing like an additive, right? That was just changing. It wasn't changing the entire business model, right? It wasn't. These companies are valued based on how much they have in reserve, right? So a fossil fuel company like BP, for instance, its shareholders, when they decide how to value its stock, look at how much fossil fuel it has currently in production and how much fossil fuel it has in reserve. These are fields of oil that it has already laid claim to, but has not yet extracted. Now, if they were to dig up all of the fossil fuels these companies already have in reserve and are already built into their valuation, I mean, we're at 4 degrees warming, and we are already experiencing the impacts of 1 degree. So their business model is in crisis. They are still profitable right now. And so what I think we need governments to do is expropriate these companies, nationalize them or internationalize them. And then we use the remaining profits from the dying days of fossil fuels to pay for that Marshall Plan for Planet Earth that we talked about earlier. Also, we can take some of the trillions the U.S. spends on the military and put it into that pot as well. So the money is there. It gets more expensive every year that we delay. I'm reminded that John Kerry, under the Obama administration, when he was foreign secretary, was fighting climate reparations. And the longer they delay and the more expensive the impacts, I mean, the floods in Pakistan, we don't know what they're going to be, what the cost is going to be, but we've heard figures like 20 billion, right? Or even more, you correct me. So the longer we delay, the higher the price tag of just impacts becomes. And so it has to happen.
I think before we go to the questions that people are putting in the chat, you mentioned Arla's book and You Have Not Yet Been Defeated. And I'm just wondering, are there other texts or materials that you think people should be arming themselves with at this moment? Things that can help us think in new ways, that can present new imaginations that you feel are critical?
Yeah, there's some wonderful, there's a new book out from Haymarket called Rehearsals for Living that I really love. It's Leanne Simpson and Robin Maynard writing letters back and forth. Leanne Simpson is an Anishinaabe intellectual and artist, and Robin Maynard is a Black Canadian writer, thinker, activist, and really it's really about this kind of cosmology question of like, what is the worldview that is the alternative to this crashing apocalypse that has already happened? I mean, that's the important thing about where this text begins, is saying, kind of the white world talks about the apocalypse in the future, but from a Black and Indigenous perspective, the apocalypse happened 500 years ago, and we are in a post-apocalyptic landscape. And I think that shift in sort of where we date the crisis is very, very important, coming back to where we started. Julian Agon's book, No Place for Eight-Spotted Butterfly, is I think I'm getting the title right. Will you check that?
Mm-hmm.
They've just it's a new title, and there's also a really good reader called All We Can Save, which is a collection of women writing about the climate crisis, a feminist anthology that I give to my students. Just a few ideas.
Great. Mariam, do you want to read through the questions? Is Mariam still here? That people
Yep, I'm here.
Great.
I hope everyone can hear me. Okay. I'll just start. There are a couple of them. Amar has asked, do you think it's possible to fight climate change without taking the capitalists like Jeff Bezos, etc., on board?
Yes, I do. We have to take their money, not take them on board. Look, I don't think that I think that these levels of inequality are completely untenable and obscene. And the very fact, that you can have this era of spacefaring billionaires, in the middle of a sea of misery, just launching their vanity space projects, I think is just such a symbol of why no. I mean, they would love for us to believe that they're going to fix this for us, right? I mean, Jeff Bezos is a guy who built an empire, named after an Amazon rainforest that is, about to become a net carbon emitter, as opposed to a carbon sink, because it was early, like he was looking for an A name that would come up quickly on Google searches or something like that. I mean, the mediocrity of these guys is just unbelievable to me. But yeah, an empire based on cardboard boxes is not going to be a solution to the climate crisis, and we have to get real about this. They have infrastructure that we need. They've built some incredible infrastructure that is going to be part of what we need for relief efforts, that what we need to respond to the crisis that they themselves have created. I understand that people cast this kind of thing as impractical, and there's a school of thought that says, no, we have to work with them. They're the ones with all the money, and they're the ones with all the capacity. But they have all the money precisely because they put themselves first and will continue to put themselves first. And it really is ground zero for greenwashing. And I've been writing about this for a long time. Jeff Bezos is not the first billionaire to announce that he was going to save the planet with a prize or with, by giving all of his profits away or whatever it is. Richard Branson did it before him. He gave the largest donation pledge in the history of philanthropy, said he would spend all of his profits from airlines and trains and put it all into solving the climate crisis. And then he changed his mind because it was not enforceable. And this idea of just kind of like billionaires out of the goodness of their hearts fixing this for us is just a colossal waste of time. We're not serfs. We don't need to accept this.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Okay, good. Saket has asked, do you see any possibility that rich countries and polluters would actually consider loss and damage at COP27 after these unprecedented flooding in Pakistan?
I think this is why, I think Egyptian activists haven't called for a boycott of COP, haven't said for this not to happen, because it is happening in Egypt. And this is going to be the climate summit where loss and damage will be on the agenda as never before. I've been covering these climate summits for a long time. I've been to a few of them, not going to this one, but I think that it never was really on the agenda in the way it's going to be on the agenda here. And a lot of that has to do with Pakistan. And I think we just have to do everything we can to make sure that it doesn't kind of get brushed aside in the way that John Kerry is attempting to do, to make it seem like absurd. Oh, it's ridiculous. Who has trillions of dollars, right? Mm-hmm. Or getting cast as ancient history, or trying to pass the buck to China and India. We know that emissions are cumulative. We're talking about a couple centuries of emissions, and we know who's most responsible for that. And so, yeah, we have to talk about loss and damage. I think that it is possible if we have sort of laser focus on this, that something can come out of it. And then that raises the question of who's going to be trusted with the money, and how to do the kind of thing that you're doing right now with flood relief, which is getting the money, getting the reparations into the hands of the people who need it and deserve it.
Can I just jump in and ask, with COP27 coming up, what are ways for us to be laser focused on it? Is it a question of, for those of us who are not in Egypt, is it about writing? Is it about what? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's about writing. It's about local organizing. I mean, it's not, in the lead up, during other COPs, there have been simultaneous demonstrations outside of the country, right? And I think it would be very good if there was some of that this time, especially because it's going to be really, really constrained in Egypt. The ability, there'll be like a little protest pen where people will wave signs and so on, but it's going to be it's going to be much tamer. It's also very expensive to go, so there's not going to be as much of a civil society presence in Egypt. But people who are not there, and I think particularly people who are in severely impacted parts of the world, can raise their voices. And this is a moment where we are going to have 2 weeks where the international media is going to focus on climate change. That's one thing we know about these COPs is that they do focus the minds, and so we have a chance to get some messages out.
And just for those wondering like me, it's November 6th to November 18th. So anyone who's planning on protesting and writing, and those are your dates. Mariam.
Okay, great. Nimra has asked, while there is a lot of focus on the underlying system structures of the climate crisis, how can individuals or organizations working in such capacities push for climate justice internally?
Internally, like within organizations, or
I'm guessing maybe within our own countries, perhaps.
That's the task, and I think it depends a little bit on where we live, and what the capacity is. Where I live in Canada, there's a big push for legislation around under the frame of a just transition, right? A justice-based transition. So we have a climate emergency. We also have a housing emergency. Housing is completely unaffordable for more and more people. We need money for public transit. Lots of communities aren't connected from transit. And then there's workers who are in high carbon fields, right? Who are, if we do what's right for climate, they stand to lose their incomes, right? So if we want to bring people with us, and this is, I think, what's exciting about climate justice, is that for a long time, when people thought about doing what's right about climate, it was about, I have to give something up, right? I have to stop eating this thing, or I have to stop driving this car. I have to do, this is the way it was sort of framed in the global north, was all about sacrifice. And there are sacrifices. Like I said, we do have to stop doing the things that are causing the crisis, but there are also benefits. And we haven't talked enough about what the benefits can be, that people can have green housing that is better than the current housing that they have, that they can have transit that is better than the transit that they have. They can have cities that are much more livable, less choked by pollution. They can have jobs that pay them better, right? But none of this is going to happen on its own. This is why we need a vision. We sometimes call it a Green New Deal, based on what happened during the Great Depression, where there were huge investments that lifted people out of poverty and built infrastructure that was needed. I talked about how Bolivia used the Marshall Plan for Planet Earth. That's another time where there was these huge investments in infrastructure that improved people's daily life. And this is why I think, when you say we need to fight poverty and climate change at the same time, you can either be overwhelmed by that and go like, oh no, climate change is enough on its own. Let's just fight climate change and not muddy it up with poverty, right? And this is what you hear from sort of elite green groups a little bit, right? But in fact, anybody who does work on the ground knows that most people are much too preoccupied with daily emergencies of just hanging on by their fingernails than to focus on climate change. So if you can bring the fight for a better daily existence with the fight to lower emissions, you actually build a much larger, more diverse, more robust, more motivated movement, because it isn't just about stopping an apocalypse out in the future. It's about improving life right now. It's about food security. It's about water security. It's about housing security. That's going to build a non-elite, climate justice from below.
Okay, Minal, I think, has a question next. Minal, why don't you go ahead?
Hi. I didn't have a question. I just had a comment. So I work for the UN and I work in the Arab region. So I'm working on COP, but from the UN kind of perspective. And I just wanted to kind of say we haven't in our internal meetings with governments or state parties so far leading up to the COP, we really haven't had enough conversations about, for example, freedom of expression in Egypt or actual climate activists. So the climate activists from the region or the Arab region are very much the kind of corporate climate activists. So, and it's kind of exhausting because we never really hear from actual communities who are affected by climate change. So I think Pakistan is doing a good job of kind of bringing that to the fore and kind of driving the global conversation. But what we really need from our perspective is we need people to put pressure on their governments to come to COP and to say, like, this is the agenda and this is what you need to happen, because we have, for example, national adaptation plans and we have a climate change framework and we have all of that, but every year we have pledges, but we have no action. So this year, we had a meeting last week and what they were talking about was something like $40 million a year for climate adaptation. And that's nothing. That's globally. Is what countries are talking about pledging. So, it's nothing. And also, we're obviously the conversation, there's pavilions for all the major private sector actors. So we have pavilions for all the major private sector actors. We have pavilions for in the Arab region, but also outside all of that. But I think, the way to make this COP not a corporate COP is if people like us write about it and kind of influence our governments to bring that agenda to the table, because otherwise it's just going to be a corporate COP, and that's kind of where I see this going. So we'll talk about like damage and all of that, but then we'll come out with a pledge of like $40 million, and even that will never be translated into action. So what the Egyptian government is saying, and which I agree with, is it has to be an implementation COP, and it will only be an implementation COP if all of us kind of keep talking about it, basically. So I just wanted to kind of say that.
Yeah, and I thank you so much, Manal. And I think that it's true that there's been a kind of a scandalous overlooking of the context where this is happening. Like, I see it as a real failure of solidarity with a human rights nightmare that is unfolding in Egypt. And so even something like there's going to be like a pavilion where all of the funders are going to go, all the foundations, like to kind of shower money on those corporate green groups. Meanwhile, if you're a human rights organization or an environmental organization in Egypt and you take a cent of foreign money, you'll end up in jail, right? So there's this, it's a corporate COP. It's in Sharm el-Sheikh. The Egyptian government is putting out videos of people taking outdoor showers and scuba diving lessons and positioning this as like a fantastic beach vacation. The pressure has to come, as you say, from people outside of Egypt, putting pressure on their governments before they go, raising the alarm in the communities that are directly impacted, because Sharm el-Sheikh is going to be fantasy land.
Okay. The next question is from Yolanda, who asks, besides the usual net zero climate positive business models and purpose statements, what do you think the most important role of brands is to help work towards changing the system and worldview?
The role of brands. That's interesting. I don't know what the role of brands are. The first book I wrote many, many moons ago was called No Logo, and it was sort of about the branding takeover of the world. I think that there are some brands that are genuinely trying to be green. I know a little bit about Patagonia, for instance, which is an outdoor sort of adventure clothing company and gear company, and they just announced that all of their profits are going to be going to the climate fight, which is interesting. But like I know a little bit about the company. I know the director of the company, Yvon Chouinard, And they did this interesting thing a few years ago where they took out this whole full page ad in the New York Times that with a picture of one of their jackets, and it said, "Don't buy this jacket." And it talked about all of the inputs. So this is a green company. You know, they're always talking about how they make their clothing out of, you know, recycled plastic bottles and all of this stuff, right? They're as green as you can get, okay, as far as brands go. But they actually did an honest accounting of the fact that even though they're so green and they're doing everything they can and they have solar panels on their, you know, headquarters and so on, this jacket still has, you know, a net carbon emissions. It's not a good thing for the environment. So they take out this full page ad that says, "Don't buy our jacket." And they have this van where you can bring, I don't know if they have it anymore, but you could bring your old Patagonia clothing and they would mend them for free. So they're trying to actually get us to do what the thing that we don't want to do, which is shop less. You know, you're not going to shop our way out of it by buying green brands. And you know what people did? They bought the jacket. They bought a lot of the jacket. they thought they'd finally found themselves a green brand. And like I said, I've met with folks at Patagonia. They're really genuinely struggling with how you do this because, and I just told them you have to make like ugly clothing, you know, because as long as you keep making beautiful clothing, people are going to keep buying it. Yeah. I don't know what the solution is. I do think that it isn't going to be brands that are going to get us out of it. And I think if you look at the brands that are really sort of really genuinely in good conscience trying to do this, they haven't figured it out.
Okay.
You know, we're reaching so 1992 was the Rio Earth Summit. Okay, so this is the 30th anniversary of the Rio Earth Summit, which was a real breakthrough, because I think there are some people on this call who are younger than 30, right? So what that means is that for your entire life, governments have been having annual meetings to talk about lowering emissions. And every year, emissions have gone up. And at that Rio Earth Summit, the president of the United States was George W. Bush. And there was it was George Bush Sr., George W. Bush's father. And there was a big debate about whether they were even going to go to the Rio Earth Summit. And behind the scenes, there were some negotiations. And what George Bush Sr. famously said was, "I'll go, but the American way of life is not up for negotiation." And that was the condition under which they went to the Rio Earth Summit. And what is the American way of life? The American way of life is consume more and more and more and grow and grow and grow. And define success through economic growth built on, you know, more and more wasteful consumption. And so that was the deal with the devil that was made in 1992. And we are within the architecture that was created at the Rio Earth Summit. That's what created the UNFCCC. That's what created the COP conferences, and that they have every year. And the American way of life was never up for negotiation. On the contrary, it was globalized. So after 1992, you have a wave of free trade deals. You have the creation of the World Trade Organization, and this idea that you can have, a sustainable planet with more and more economic growth, more and more disposable consumption, was globalized to elites in every corner of the globe. Not to every person, but to every corner of the globe. And that is the mentality that 30 years later we have to reassess. I know it's not cheery news or easy news, but that's the thinking that got us here.
Okay, I think we'll take just one more question from Ariana, who asks, you mentioned that in order to achieve climate justice and climb out of the climate crisis, we need to be replacing old systems of colonialism, capitalism, etc., with new systems. However, the old systems have been centuries in the making and are so deeply ingrained and rooted in our society. Do you see a way in which we can overthrow these systems and introduce new systems in a timely fashion, considering we are already running out of time?
So I think when we think about new systems, partly what we're thinking about is what systems do we want to have when the shocks hit, right? Because, not only are we running out of time, we have run out of time in the sense that we are now in it. Like, to come back to where we started, that we're not in the era of forecasts. We are in the era of shocks, of serial disasters. And so it matters what kind of system we're living in, when those shocks hit. It isn't. It is about doing what's necessary to prevent truly catastrophic and well, we are in catastrophic climate change, but from warming that we can't levels of warming that we can't survive. So we have to lower emissions, but we also have to build societies that value care work, that show that it's possible to take care of each other. And it's interesting, during in many parts of the world, and not only in wealthier parts of the world, we saw extraordinary mutual aid during the early days of the COVID crisis. We saw governments able to bring food to everybody who needed it. But think about the way Kerala responded to COVID. That families that were isolating got hot food. I mean, they just organized that. So yes, these structures are in place, but they aren't the only structures. And what we've seen is something quite remarkable in the ability of capitalist societies to pivot in the midst of disasters. It didn't last for very long, but in my country, in Canada, they covered the majority of people's wages for more than a year during COVID. This is a government that that has had austerity like the rest of the world and sort of thrown up their hands and said we can't do anything. Suddenly they figured out how to do something to help people. So maybe it's not as hard as we think it is. And there are systems that have been protected, healthcare systems, education systems, and that can be the infrastructure that is the sort of early building blocks for a transition. And also these worldviews that were not extinguished. The genocides were not complete. And this is why it's important, to listen to voices that have kept those worldviews, those cosmologies alive, despite attempts to wipe them out. And many of the indigenous leaders who I talk to say, this is why we kept our worldviews alive all these years and our ceremonies alive and our practices alive, because we knew they'd be needed, because we knew this worldview would crash.
I just want to say thank you, Naomi, for all your time. I know how busy you are and how many things you have on your plate. Thank you for talking to us. You've given me hope. I felt that rare glimmer of it listening to you talk. Thank you also for reminding us that all our struggles are connected, and the way in which we survive is to support each other across boundaries, across continents, and across crises. And I hope that people here will get those books and will write and organize ahead of COP. Thank you also to Mariam for coordinating all this, to Minal, and really to everyone who chose to be here with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a real privilege. Thank you for all the work you're doing. Thank you all for donating. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Bye.